Hi, it's Katrina. Number 10. Ancient leprosy. A skull has been found on an uninhabited Caribbean island. This in itself is extraordinarily rare. Joined by the fact that the skull has evidence of leprosy, things get even rarer. It's one of the only skulls found on the island that's ever been dated using radiocarbon dating methods. Most other human remains are dated based on whatever artifacts or materials are nearby. These bones come from the late 18th century, from a time when the island of Petite Moustique was used as a leprosarium. Think of a sanitarium, except for people with leprosy. Throughout the 1800s, when people became infected with leprosy, they were sent to isolated islands just like this one to prevent spreading the disease. People of the day just didn't know what else to do with the sick. And believe it or not, this did not only happen in the Caribbean, it also happened on the island of Molokai in Hawaii, with people who had leprosy being segregated from the general population. And although we know that leprosy was prevalent in the Caribbean starting in the middle of the 17th century, this is one of the first times archaeologists have actually found skeletal evidence of the disease. Leprosy causes the disfigurement of a person's hands and feet and face, spreading until a person's limbs are consumed. So it was common back in the day to isolate the sick and hide them, not only because they would become hideous, but because the average person didn't want to become like them, and so everyone with leprosy was shunned. Number 9. Coffin on the golf course. In a pond on a golf course in England, researchers discovered a strange tree trunk coffin. The tree sarcophagus dates back to the Bronze Age and was found to contain human remains and an axe. The amazing discovery was pretty recent, found in 2019. Construction workers were called in to renovate the golf course pond when they came across the coffin by accident. It's been dated to 4,000 years ago and is currently undergoing preservation at the Collection Museum in Lincoln before it's put on display. According to researchers from the University of Sheffield, the sarcophagus would have weighed about half a ton when it was put in the ground. It was made from the hollowed trunk of an oak tree, then buried underneath a massive mound of gravel. Experts believe whoever was buried in the tree was an elite member of the Bronze Age society. This was an immense undertaking by the ancient people of England, and so it was reserved for only the top brass of the community. Mark Caswell, one of the members of the team, says the axe is so well preserved that it looks as though it was made yesterday. But we don't actually know if the axe was used in battle or if it was more of a symbolic burial good. To date, there have only been about 65 of these types of burials found in England. Number 8. The oldest anatomical specimen. The oldest anatomical specimen specifically used for medical research dates back to the 1200s. It might not be the oldest in the world, technically, but it is the oldest known in Europe. This gruesome thing is currently housed in a private collection. It consists of nothing except a human head and shoulders, looking like any Roman emperor's bust sitting on a stand in a palace. Except this one is a real human corpse. Well, the top half. This individual had the top of their skull removed along with their brain and their face gnawed on by a rat. Their face even has traces of insect larvae that were probably laid after they died. As for the arteries, they've been filled with red metal wax to help keep the specimen preserved. We don't know exactly who this person was, but we know that they were turned into a medical specimen sometime around the year 1200. This was during the Dark Ages. Yet despite the barbarism of the Dark Ages, forensic scientist Philippe Charlier says this specimen is proof that they were still advancing ever so slightly with medicine. Somebody went through all the trouble of filling this person's circulatory system with beeswax, lime, and cinnabar mercury to preserve the body and give the circulatory system a bit of color. His body was dissected and then kept somewhere for continued medical education. He may have been a prisoner, he could have been institutionalized, or he could have simply been a dead man who was unwillingly donated to science. Number 7. Idol of the Painted Temple. The Pachacamac idol is an oddly disturbing wooden statue of a deity called Ixma. At least, this is who historians think the idol represents. To understand the idol fully, we need to go back to Peru in the 8th century AD. On the northern coast, there was a city called Pachacamac. This city was home to a small chieftainship, with the people here worshipping a god called Ixma. The city itself spanned over 1,500 acres of land, and for a solid 1,000 years, it was occupied by worshippers of Ixma. The principal place of worship was the Painted Temple, which today is nothing but a sad ruin, barely distinguishable from the desert in which it lies. The people who lived here didn't have much to do with the Inca Empire, but after the Inca were destroyed in 1533, the conquistador Francisco Pizarro sent his forces to the central coast, to Pachacamac. Francisco's brother Hernando then walked straight to the front of the Painted Temple, picked up a great idol representing the local people's god, and smashed it to pieces. The Spanish were absolute in their rule that the indigenous people would no longer worship their own gods. Everyone had to switch to Christianity. The easiest way for the Spanish to make sure this happened was by destroying the temples, smashing all their idols, and erasing their gods from existence. Fast forward to the 1900s, archaeologists found the sculpture of the Painted Temple in a heap of rubble. Some say it's the same idol that was smashed by Hernando Pizarro almost 600 years ago. Number 6. Gladiator Holding Cell. 172 years ago, a Roman amphitheater was discovered near Kent, England. You probably know by now that Rome invaded Britain around 2,000 years ago, and that it was the furthest reach of their great empire. The Romans built roads, towns, fortifications, and even amphitheaters in what is today England. This particular theater had been used for all kinds of exciting live entertainment, including gladiator battles. Even though the amphitheater was discovered a very long time ago, archaeologists only recently found a rather spooky cell. It was used to hold the people and even sometimes the animals who were about to be executed in front of a live audience. The theater was built in the 1st century and could hold about 5,000 spectators, and it would have been one of the most popular places in ancient England. The cell that was just discovered had been where the gladiators hung out as they waited to do battle, either willfully or with no other choice. Archaeologists didn't actually find gladiator bones in the cell. Instead, they found the random skeleton of a cat buried at the edge of the cell. They excavated the cat and named it Maxipus. Do you think this mysterious cat belonged to one of the gladiators? Let me know in the comments below. Number 5. Jesus in a tree. There is a very disturbing sculpture of Jesus being absorbed inside a tree. To understand why the sculpture is slowly being eaten by a tree, we need to take a trip back in time to World War II. In the 1940s, the tiny village of Lubkov in Poland was nearly destroyed. Today, there are only a few pieces of the town left, such as an abandoned cemetery and the ruined foundations of a church. Most of the town, even its ruins, have been reclaimed by nature. The sculpture of Jesus is one of them. From what anyone can tell, the statue had once been your standard depiction of Jesus crucified on the cross. But somehow, a tree began to grow around the statue after the war. Since the town has been neglected for over 70 years, the tree has just kept on growing around the statue of the Savior. Now, the only parts of him that are visible are his head and torso. Nearby, even the wooden crosses used to mark the graves have also been consumed by the trees. Headstones are completely covered in moss, the wooden crosses are swallowed by roots, and Jesus is slowly being absorbed into nature by the trunk of a tree. It's a fascinating and eerie example of nature reclaiming its domain. Number 4. Ancient mercury poisoning. Some unusual bones have been uncovered in Spain and Portugal. In fact, quite a lot of bones have been found in Spain and Portugal. The bones of 370 people who lived throughout the late Neolithic and Copper Age. The bones date as far back as 5,000 years ago and have shown scientists the first ever evidence of mercury poisoning in humans. We know all about mercury poisoning today, but it took a lot of sickness and a lot of death for us to get a hold on it. Back in 2900 BC, people didn't know anything about mercury poisoning, but what they did know was that if they smashed cinnabar, it transformed into a bright red powder that they could use for painting or to get really high. A team of scientists with the University of North Carolina were interested in seeing how their use of cinnabar was affecting the ancient people in the area. So they looked closely at the bones taken from 370 people, excavated from 50 tombs across 23 archaeological sites. They discovered that the people had indeed been victims of mercury poisoning. The poisoning was because of their exposure to cinnabar. a mineral that forms naturally in volcanic areas across the world. In Iberia, cinnabar was used frequently for thousands and thousands of years as a pigment and as a medical substance. People even mined for it all the way back in 5300 BC. The issue for these ancient people was that they had no idea the cinnabar had mercury in it and that it was wildly poisonous. They used the pigments to paint their body, sniffed it like a drug, and unwittingly poisoned themselves. Fortunately for them, it probably didn't cause too many issues since the average lifespan at the time was less than 30 years anyway. Number 3. Celtic woman buried in a tree. In yet another unusual tree-related discovery, the ancient body of a woman was found buried inside a hollowed-out tree in Switzerland. According to the researchers, this woman died 2,200 years ago. She had been part of a Celtic tribe, perhaps even one of the most prestigious members of the tribe. She was discovered buried in very fine clothes and adorned with jewelry. The interesting thing is that the woman was not the only one of her kind to be buried in a tree coffin. Celts from the Iron Age frequently buried members of their tribes in chunks of trees. This particular burial comes from around the year 200 BC, with the woman being around 40 years old when she died. Her remains were found in the Swiss city of Zurich. Looking around at the modern capital now, it's difficult to imagine that it was once a tiny settlement filled with tribespeople. As for what made this woman so special, it comes down to her fine clothes and jewelry. Judging by the scraps preserved in her grave, archaeologists say she was probably wearing a dress of sheep's wool and a coat of sheepskin when she died. And because she was buried still wearing bronze bracelets, a huge bronze belt, and a necklace of amber and glass, experts say she was definitely a very important person. They just don't know why or how. Number 2. Peruvian burial tombs. A team of archaeologists has discovered the remains of 29 people buried at an ancient Peruvian temple. While it's hard to say for certain, most of the dead people appear to have been used as human sacrifices, with at least 3 of them being children and 1 of them being a teenager. They were buried over 1,000 years ago in Huaca Santa Rosa de Pucallpa, located in the coastal region of Lambayeque. The bodies of the children and the teenager belonged to members of the Wari culture, while the other 25 bodies came from the Moche culture. The Wari flourished in the central Andes from between the 7th and 13th centuries. The Moche culture flourished right before them from between the 1st and the 6th centuries. The skeletons of the Moche people were found within clay tombs and special burial chambers, along with the sacrificed bodies of llamas and alpacas, and even guinea pigs. But the 4 bodies of the youngsters were discovered buried in the dirt at the front of the temple. These 4 had without a doubt been sacrificed. The big mystery here is trying to figure out why. The Moche had inhabited the region first, yet it was the Wari who built the temple. There seems to have been some kind of transitional period in which the last of the Moche were buried beneath the new temple, while those from the Wari's own tribe were sacrificed. Number 1. Bones under the garage. In western Slovakia, a man was digging the foundation for his new garage when he made a terrifying discovery. He hadn't made much progress on his project before he uncovered a human skull. Assuming he had just come across the victim of a murder, he phoned the police. But after a bit of an investigation, another skull was discovered. Both of the skulls appeared to be extremely old. Radiocarbon dating placed them around the year 421 AD, or just about 1,600 years ago. This was clearly an archaeological matter and not one for the police. Experts surveyed his property and discovered that he had a single grave with the body of 2 women inside of it, but nobody knows who these women might have been. The 400s and 500s were known as the migration period. This was when the Huns, the Lombards, the Goths, the Rugians, the Heruli all started moving into western Slovakia. People from all over Asia and Europe were spreading throughout Europe with great determination. This resulted in a lot of mixing of the various tribes, leading to a very diverse Europe. And to make matters worse, archaeologists didn't find any grave goods. This means the women had probably had their grave robbed, which was pretty common back then. Plus, one of the skeletons had been smashed as if someone had trampled on it while searching for treasures. What would you do if you found ancient bones hiding underneath your garage? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching! Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Bye!